Since we're getting started a bit late, I will be very brief in the introductions. We have here Gabriella Fitzgerald, who is the CEO of, Executive Vice President for American Express. Hopefully on her way to being CEO.
One day, one day.
Maya Pearson, who is the CEO of MSL Canada, with publicists. Gabriella Ramos, who has already been introduced as the Chief of Staff and the Sherpa for the G20 and the OECD. And to my extreme left, Kelli Wright, Executive for Special Projects with the ExxonMobil Corporation. I think that probably you will agree with me that we are at a particularly critical moment in our history. We are confronting a series of global challenges. In fact, it's probably not inaccurate to say global catastrophic risks, from climate change to income disparities, which are beginning to have political implications, to poverty. We have celebrated over the last few years the remarkable progress that we have made in reducing extreme poverty from something like 2 billion people in the early 90s to less than 800 million today. And yet, it remains a very serious problem. If you use a poverty line of $5.50, close to 48% of the world's population can be characterized as poor. So this is a problem that we have to confront. And then, of course, we have issues that are more in the political arena, perhaps the resurgence of an arms race, which then may have implications in the future in the area of peace and security and so on. In addition to this, of course, we have ongoing technological change. The last issue of the World Development Report put out by the World Bank was actually focused on the future of work and the changing nature of work. And one of the interesting insights that come from that report is that we don't really know what is going to be the impact of technological change on employment and on job creation. Many experts think that it is going to create new jobs. Other experts think that it will be a net destroyer of jobs. So this, again, casts some uncertainty on the outlook for employment, including, of course, the employment of women. Christine Lagarde, in her very, very good interview yesterday, mentioned a database that has been put together by the World Bank that looks at ways in which countries are using the law, the civil code, the constitution, family law, the tax code, the labor code, to embed in the law discriminations against women. To embed ways in which basically women are prevented from making her contribution, to the economy. The data that comes out of this database is really quite fascinating, and what it shows, I think somewhat discouragingly, is that of the 189 countries covered by this database, there are only 10%, only about 18 countries of which you can say that the law is not discriminating against women in some way. In other words, 90% of the countries have embedded in the law, various forms of discrimination. Sometimes it is 1 or 2 or 3, but there are countries that have 10 or 15 or 20 or 25, right? Which shows you, the road that we have ahead of us in order to encourage, fuller participation of women in the economy. In parallel, over the last 20, 30 years, we have accumulated a body of knowledge that suggests that the incorporation of women into the labor force has multiple beneficial economic effects. And I want that to be the starting point for this conversation. So I will direct my first question to Gabriella Ramos, sitting on my right. And I will ask her to comment a little bit on a statement that was made yesterday by Christine Lagarde concerning the importance of quotas. Ms. Lagarde began by saying that she wanted to be cautious, that she hadn't at the beginning been a strong supporter of quotas, but that now she was more in favor of them. the data that we have accumulated over the last 20, 25 years suggests that quotas can be a very useful mechanism to actually accelerate the integration of women into the workforce. And I would like Gabriela to tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you, and great to be here with all of you and with this fantastic panel. You just put it in the right framing, Augusto. The whole point is, how do we get rid of all the obstacles that women face while trying to fully participate in the labor market or fully realize their full potential? And I think it required a lot of changes in the laws, changes in the mindset, changes in the societal way in which we behave. But it also required hardcore decisions, and affirmative action is part of it. I was actually inspired by the fact that Madame Lagarde said that she supported quotas. Because when it comes from somebody with her visibility and I don't know if she arrived by quota or not, but the fact is that now she's supporting it. And I have to say that this is a conclusion that all the women and men that have been working on gender issues have arrived to. They are very powerful, they are useful, and at the OECD, where we are just documenting which economies, which countries are more advanced in gender equality, all of them use quotas. If you go to Iceland, if you go to Norway, if you go to Sweden, the Nordics, always the Nordics, but actually I'm seeing more and more countries using these kind of definitions. I know that there are also downsides, and some people say, oh yeah, but imagine just because you are women, you are arriving there. I would say yes. Just because you're a woman, that's fine. With me, that's fine. But the fact is that you need to have a lot of other issues. It's not just quotas. You need to have the pipeline. You need to invest in women. You need to identify talents. All what we have heard from the business sector, to really be sure that whenever you impose this hardcore decision of having percentages of women reaching this post, are not going to be having any impact on the performance of the company or on the government. But let me tell you also that the question of merit or merit base is also a myth. For me, it's a myth. Because the reality is that you see it with Mexico. We're in Mexico. Mexico adopted a quota for Congress. And I want to congratulate Mexican women because they were very low in representation of women in Congress. And with the quota, they are #1 in the OECD. #1, 50-50 equality. And when we were advancing the issue of establishing this quota, the president of Congress told me that he was very worried because he was going to be full of incompetent women. And I just told him, you know, what's the difference? We're full of incompetent men without quotas. So do we ever take a look at that? No, we should go for merit. We should go for performance. We should invest in girls. But quotas are very important. The question of stigma, and this is something for all of you, I think is very important because we defeat ourselves when we say, I don't want to be a woman arriving there by quotas. Just leave that aside because it's not about you. It's about the societal change that we need to achieve. And this is one of the very powerful tools that we have. It's not a stigma, because if you think about the fact that President Obama might have arrived to Harvard through the African American quotas, do we ever question whether he was, well, many people were terrible with him when he was president just because he was black, but do we ever question his merit? No. I think that women receive this possibility of having a space for them to grow. Then they need to deliver. And when you deliver, people will never remember whether you were arriving by quota or not.
So I'll follow on just a little bit. And first of all, I would love to just say I'm so proud to be here. This is an amazing event, and it's just been an inspiring day and a half so far. I also want to say that American Express is very honored to become a strategic partner of the Women's Forum for Economy and Society. We just joined about a year and a half ago now, and it's been a great experience, and we're very proud and honored to be part of this great organization. So on balance, I agree with quotas completely, and I think what Ms. Lagarde said yesterday, in addition to the importance of quotas, is also that we don't need them forever, but we need them for a period of time to effectively get the ball rolling and make sure that we get the representation that we need. I think she also said that she thought they were important because the data and the research of why it's important to have women in business and women in positions of leadership in government as well is out there, and yet we're not seeing a response to it. So really, put the quota in place and make it happen as a result, but it doesn't need to be there forever. I actually believe there is a stigma associated with the word quota, but there needs to be some level of forcing mechanism to make sure that we have the right representation. And in the corporate world, and I think someone mentioned this yesterday too, we talk less about quotas and more about goals and objectives and key performance indicators, and that's kind of how we would measure getting to the level of representation that we would want. I believe in that. We do that at American Express. I do it for my own team. You don't achieve what you don't measure, which was also said yesterday, so putting the objectives and goals out there for how many women you want in leadership positions feels important. Just one other sort of smaller anecdote is that there is a ratio out there that if you have fewer than 3 women in a meeting of, let's say, 10 or 15 people, you have that phenomenon of just the woman being the only woman in the room and not having a voice as a result, and there being sort of no representation. You get to that magic number of 3 somehow or another, and all of a sudden you have some level of representation, you have some level of strength, and there's an ability to not feel like the unique stand out, but actually able to contribute it in a very meaningful way. So I think quotas would help get to that magic rule of 3. The last thing I want to say is that, on balance, again, I agree with quotas, and one thing that came out in the US recently is the state of California passed a law that said all public companies doing business in the state of California, they don't need to be incorporated in the state of California, but they're doing business in the state of California, have to have at least 1 female on their board. And that is going to create something like 3,000 public board positions for women in the United States over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's just a phenomenal opportunity for women all over the world, frankly. And California is only the first state. There are going to be, I understand Washington State is in the midst of doing the same, and there are a couple others as well. So just the impact that that's going to have, the benefit that that's going to have for women in business, and frankly for these corporations, because the data is there that women on boards help companies perform, I think is really meaningful and impactful, and therefore I do believe in quotas as well.
Okay. It's interesting that in the United Kingdom, 2 years ago, they did a survey of 6,500 companies listed in the stock exchange. And they split the sample into 2 groups, one with 3 or more women directors, and the rest, the ones with low female participation on the board. And the results were really fascinating. The companies that have more women on the board are much less prone to scandals involving bribery, corruption, and other things which tend to undermine confidence in the economy and therefore eventually affect economic growth. Let me shift the gears a little bit and mention that while progress has been made in sort of encouraging the participation of women in parliaments, we still have a long way to go. The average for all countries in the world is about 22%. It's better than it was 20 years ago, but we still have much more progress to be made. However, one area where women are largely absent is in ministries of finance and as governors of central banks. In those centers of power within the government where decisions are made on how resources are going to be allocated, right? Christine Lagarde yesterday mentioned gender budgeting, right? And the fact is that the budget in most countries, I'm sure this is the case in Mexico, the budget remains the most important instrument, for doing social policy, for advancing a variety of different goals, to enhance prosperity and inclusion and diversity. And so what I like to do now is basically ask the panelists, and in particular, I will direct my question to Kelli, to tell us a little bit about sort of resource allocation and in what ways, could the greater participation of women into this space would actually lead, to better utilization of resources.
Okay, thank you for the question, Augusto, and I'm very glad to be here. I'd like to take a minute to explain, first of all, why governments should care about prioritizing spending to get more women involved in technology and innovation. And in my industry, the energy industry, one of the challenges that we're aware that faces society is that the demand for energy will increase by about 25% by the year 2040. And that's due to population growth as well as people moving from the lower class to the middle class. So access to clean, affordable energy is important. But the but here is we need to find a way to do this while mitigating the risks to the environment, which includes climate change as one, but that's not the only. And in order to achieve this, getting the energy that society needs for the future, while mitigating the risk to the environment, we need technology solutions that do not exist today. And in order to develop those technology solutions, we need all of the best and brightest minds in the world working on these problems. And one way of increasing the brightest minds to work in technology is getting more women into the STEM pipeline. So in terms of what government can do, certainly prioritizing spending towards education, programs that reduce the bias in our schools. We know that approximately 1/3 of STEM degrees go to women, yet there is no data that shows that women are not as proficient in science and mathematics as men are. It tends to be the paradigms, the gender paradigms, that men are encouraged to pursue sciences, whereas women are encouraged into other areas. So by addressing the bias in our educational system and giving programs that support and mentor women, that is one way that governments can progress towards this challenge of getting more women in STEM. I'd also like to articulate that private industry has a role to play here as well, and partnering with governments in programs on how we get more women interested in the sciences. And a few examples within ExxonMobil that we have, there's a program that we run in the United States around our research centers and facilities called Introduce a Girl to Science and Engineering. And our aim there is getting towards the middle school girls, aged 10 through 13, before they're making choices about what coursework they're going to take that will prepare them for life after secondary school, and show them that women can be in the sciences. It's possible to be feminine and be a scientist. And we show them exciting careers that women can have and make it appealing. There's also programs that we have in place in Mexico as well. For example, our activities with Junior Achievement, there's a Thinking of Your Career program, and in there we look at supporting STEM projects as well. And that's focused on men and women, but there's approximately 50% representation of women in that program. So I think having good partnerships between government and private industry to prioritize spending towards the sciences will be very important going forward.
Maya?
Sure. And just to add on that, in terms of young women getting into STEM, when we think about how we're socialized at very young ages, we think boys are good at math and girls are not. And for us to create this pipeline and for us to create this next generation of leaders in the tech industry and to really fuel the growth of what is going to be a major growth sector for us around the world, is that I really think we need to put more focus on role models and women who are achieving in these sectors and making sure that they're externally focused and that they have strong brands and that they dominate more of the covers of magazines and in the news media and are featured as experts so that young women see themselves in those roles. And I think, as women in tech, we only have so much time, right? We could sponsor and mentor a number of women and you might get to, 10, 20 in a year that's meaningful. But if we become more of almost a billboard for what women can do in this industry and what women can do in tech, we can really try to influence a broader base. And I think women as a whole are not as comfortable with self-promotion and being out there and being externally focused. But it's important because if we don't do that, young women will never believe it's possible. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done within corporations around the world in terms of supporting their senior leadership teams and female leaders, and helping to train them and give them the expertise and the funding to speak about these issues, to be externally profiled, so that they also, you know, reflect the gender diversity that they have within their organizations, but they make those fields attractive to young women, and that young women can relate to a future career in those areas.
Gabriela?
I completely agree. I think that STEM and the lack of women of STEM is where all these expectations of what is meant to be a woman and what's meant to be is where it really gets completely confirmed, because you are not meant to be an engineer. And I have to say that my dad wanted me to be an engineer, so, and I did say no, so. But in any case, at least he infused this self-confidence that we don't see in girls when dealing with maths, and we have documented in the OECD, even girls that in our PISA study are top performers in math will never acknowledge it that they are, and boys will be. So I completely agree. It's this question of stereotyping. Is the question of self-confidence, and we need some rebalancing, more confidence for men, for women, less confidence for men, some kind of better distribution of confidence in the world. But the whole point of STEM is to change those expectations, but there is another angle that is more worrisome, that is the question of the digital transformation. We have been talking about the future of work, we have been talking about automation, we have been talking about what kind of skills I'm gonna need. And the fact is that if women are not represented in STEM, because only 1 out of 3 girls choose to go into engineering or science, 1 out of 4 choose to go to ITC. The Silicon Valley don't have women. If we think in the corporate world, even less represented are women in the digital world. And more complex, the development of software and the ownership of databases, and you know that, is developed by male-only teams. Women produce 13% of innovations in the world in terms of patents. And so it's not only about trying to boost the willingness of girls into getting into engineering, but how are we going to be represented in the future of work, in the digital revolution, if we are so underrepresented in the technological transformation? I think this is one of the most worrisome, because it's the future. Well, it's the future that is already here, but that is not putting the emphasis on these issues.
Right.
And just in terms of when you think about AI, and if men are behind that technology and what is getting served to us, as we move into a world that's more automated and AI has more power, then all of our news, all of our content, all of the things that influence us day in and day out on social channels, on our phones that all our children are glued to every day, will all be based on their perceptions and their view of the world. And that needs to change as well, because AI is going to be a scary place if more women are not behind AI.
Okay. You know, one of the paradoxes that we see with the data is that while over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years, we have made enormous progress in educating young girls and women, to the point where now school enrollment rates in some countries are actually higher than that of boys, there remains a huge gap in terms of labor participation rates. In every country of the world, without exception, the labor force participation rate of women is lower than that of men. From a few percentage points in Denmark to 50 percentage points in places like Iran and many of the countries in the Middle East. And so this brings me to the whole question of, you know, what is it that is preventing a more rapid incorporation of women into the job market? You know, the labor force participation rate of women has been stuck for the last 30 years. We made great progress, you know, if you take a 100-year perspective, but since 1980, basically, there hasn't been much movement, right? And so we now turn to this particular question. I want to begin with Gabriela to tell us a little bit about sort of the ideal workplace for women. You know, what aspects of the workplace are actually discouraging the integration of women into the job market, and what are the things that we can do actually to make it more palatable, more appealing?
Sounds Good, yeah. I actually would love to talk from the perspective of the things that I think encourage women to be in the workplace and stay in the workplace and advance there. I've been with American Express for 20 years plus now, and feel that I've had a really robust and exciting career that's been fulfilling, and the company's enabled me to have the professional advancement that I've wanted. And I think some of the things that the company does to really enable this for women who work there are, culture, which is critically important, and I think we have a great cultural foundation to support and advance women. The leadership and some of the leadership beliefs that we have and that we practice, and then the focus on innovation. And I'll talk a little bit about each three of those. So culture, which I really think sets the foundation for inclusion, not just advancing women, but inclusion across the board. One of our foundational principles is just that our employees are our most critical asset, one of the most valuable things to our company, and one of the most valuable assets to help us grow over time. All of our employees, the behavior is that they get treated with respect and with dignity. And this is really supported by a set of principles in the company. So we have something that we call our Blue Box values. Our brand is the Blue Box, for those of you who might not have seen it. And we call them our Blue Box values. And three of them really play a big role in making sure that we're setting the stage for inclusion. So one is we do what's right. We respect people, and we need different views as well. We also have a code of conduct that every employee has to be trained in and sign and commit to, and that does a lot to support inclusion and diversity and protection of women and things like being harassed on the job, and really just sets the stage for what it means to be a good employee and behave appropriately on the job. And we have also a host of recourse channels that any employee could use if they feel like they are not being supported in the right way. So I think all of those things, set the tone for the culture, which is very focused on its employees and ensuring that its employees are engaged and satisfied and feel like they have opportunity, and really sets the stage for inclusion as well. On the leadership front, what I've seen in my career there is that you don't succeed at the company without being a strong leader and without being a strong people leader. And that means that you have to motivate and inspire your people. You have to find ways to develop them, both from a personal perspective as well as a career perspective. And then you really need to bring them along with you as well, too. You're not valued as a leader if you're leaving your people behind, if you're excluding them, if you're not coaching them, if you're not making them successful as well. Leaders are also really focused on ensuring that they're providing feedback to their teams throughout the course of the year, and this is something that I think helps women in particular. Women often overjudge themselves and assess themselves more harshly or more critically than men do, and getting supportive feedback as well as development feedback, and especially getting that from male colleagues, is something that helps quite a bit. We also have leadership principles, one of which is leading with courage, and that means having the ability or having the courage to really be able to speak up, state your mind, do it respectfully, but make sure that that you have a voice in the room, and make the tough decisions and make the tough calls as well. I think all of these things enable women to feel empowered in the organization, and make it a good place for development of women and advancement of their careers. Another thing that has started to happen more recently is really just starting to put women into stretch roles, what we would call a role that would stretch their capabilities and skills. Many of you have probably heard the stat that typically women feel like they need to know 80% to 100% of the job to feel like they're ready for the next job or for the next level, and men are more along the lines of 40 to 60%. So more increasingly, we're taking a look at women who are great performers and might have 50% of the skills needed, and putting them into the next role and putting them into promotional roles, and really just betting on the talent that they have and the raw skills that they have. And so far, it's been successful. Just the last thing I'll talk about very briefly is just the culture of innovation, and really just focusing on, companies like American Express cannot grow and cannot succeed in the marketplace unless we're focused on innovation 100% of the time. And I think what that does is it really creates a culture that is open to women, because you have to be open to new ideas. You have to be constantly thinking of what's going to be the next thing. You have to be seeing what's going on out in the world, and you have to be accepting and supporting of it. And I really think that creates a great basis as well for having women in the workplace and helping them advance.
Thank you, Gabriela.
I will have to go, so I just want to say fantastic set of toolkit that Gabriela has just put together. I will just only add that probably at a more structural level, the way we deal with motherhood and fatherhood is determining the opportunities of women to pursue their careers. So I just would like to bring to this perspective the fact that if we continue having workplaces that are not family friendly, that do not provide for dual parental leave, that do not provide for the infrastructure for taking care of children, men and women, and if we do not change the mindset of boys that come with very toxic masculinities, is not going to work. I think this is you went into the more practical, very concrete steps. I would say we need family-friendly policies. And I'm very sorry to leave this fantastic panel, but it has been great.
Maya, as we look at the future of work, and in particular the impact that technology is having on sort of changing the landscape for the private sector, for firms and companies and so on all over the world, can one make a case that perhaps women's particular skill set might actually put her at an advantage, at a comparative advantage with respect to men?
Absolutely. There's a number of studies that have come out recently that talk about the traits that women have around things like empathy, collaboration, teamwork, credit for the whole team versus individual, that is really aligned to where the future of technology is going, and globalization as well in terms of what's happening within corporations. And so as we look at that, so the data points to the direction that that is where the future of work is going, and those are the skill sets we need for the future. And yet women are still so underrepresented as it relates to technology. And so part of that, I think, and even on the business side, I mean, we've seen a number of reports. If you have women on your boards, your return to investors is higher. There was a report out of Spain that talked about if you have women on the R&D teams in innovation and tech, you have 40% higher return on revenue. And so there's all of these data points that clearly state that when women are working within these companies, especially in the tech industry, the performance is higher. And yet we're still not there. So we've talked earlier about pipeline. We've talked about, feeding younger women in terms of understanding and education. But then I think there's also a big role to play within corporations to change how they recruit. So you look at the recruitment practices that we're still seeing, and they're based on the skill set of men 10, 20 years ago. And so how jobs are posted and the requirements that they talk about are based on the old skill set. And so even though this recent research and studies are coming out that are talking about these other skill sets as being more valuable to the future, we haven't changed the way that we promote those jobs, the way we value them during the recruitment process. There's still very high levels of unconscious bias that we see through the recruitment process. Men are still at the top of most of these companies, so play a big role in recruitment. And therefore, until we get the training and development on that side changed, it will still be difficult for women to be the final one selected to go into those companies, because the whole system has not yet changed in terms of how we prioritize and value the skills that women bring. I think the second point is that women go into these roles or don't even apply for roles often if they don't think they have 100% of the requirements. And yet men might have 60% and they're like, absolutely I can do that, and I'll wing the other half because I can figure that out, but they have that confidence. And so I think, again, if you're on the other side of the table interviewing these candidates, you have to realize that the women may not be quite as confident or oversell themselves in the way that men do, and value that and know that they may appear to be 80% less or have the 80% less ability in the interview across those skill sets. They probably have 120 and will perform better once they get in the role. And so I think awareness and training around that from an HR and recruitment perspective will help us, because the stats are there that the kind of skill sets that women bring are the skill sets we need for the future.
Right. You know that income inequality, as you all know, is a very serious concern in the world today. And a few years ago at the World Bank, we looked at the kinds of incentives that governments can introduce to make it easier for women to join the workforce. You know, things like maternity leave, like childcare, paternity leave, and so on. We looked at something like 12 different incentives. And one of the very interesting conclusions out of that work was that those countries that make it easier for women to join the workforce through these incentives actually have lower levels of income inequality. Their Gini coefficients are actually lower. And to me, this is very, very important. I mean, it's a powerful insight because, as you know, in the world today, you know, we are grasping, we're searching for ways in which we can reduce, you know, income inequality, which takes me to Kelli. Kelli, you know, what are some of the enablers that would encourage, you know, the greater participation of women and their willingness to join the workforce?
So I'd like to take the question in two parts. I guess I see the first part is the actual diversity aspect and having more women involved in the workforce. And this is where government policy as well as private industry can set policies that encourage the full participation of women, such as family leave policies, and not just having policies in place, but having a culture in the workplace where it's accepted and encouraged for both men and women to take advantage of the family leave policies and not feel that, oh, well, the policy is there, but I worry that my dedication to my career will be questioned if I take advantage of it. The same thing goes for flexible work policies, being able to work a part-time schedule or a flexible location, for example, working from home instead of the traditional office as needed to meet the demands of your work as well as your life outside of work. The other aspect I'd like to touch on with respect to participation is the inclusion aspect. So simply having women on the payroll is one thing, and it's a step in the right direction. But the other part of that is full inclusion, so that women can really bring their whole selves to work and offer the tremendous benefits they can bring to the workforce. And in order to do that, something that ExxonMobil has been doing is a lot of training on the concepts of unconscious bias. So, you know, an easy example of this would be in a meeting, a woman states an idea and nobody acknowledges it. The meeting continues on, and then later, perhaps, a man states the same idea, and everyone says, oh, wow, that's a fabulous idea. And, you know, so first of all, how can we recognize that when it's happening? So training people that this does occur, and then how can we help each other and be allies? And not just women helping other women in the room, but men recognizing when this happens as well, so they can say, you know, that's a great point Maya just made. Let's build upon that. We're also looking at good meeting behaviors and how we can encourage different means of facilitating meetings so that everyone gets their voice heard equally. So I think we've probably all been in meetings where somebody is very vocal and they receive a majority share of the airtime in the meeting, and there's others who have personalities that are perhaps more quiet and reflective. They take information in and process and perhaps aren't as vocal, but we still need their ideas. So there are techniques that we can use, such as brainwriting is one example we use. We'll give a prompt in a meeting, and then everyone gets a sheet of paper to write their thoughts on the prompt, and then we'll have them pass the sheet of paper to the next person. And then the rule is you build upon what the person before you wrote. So it's almost like the improv technique, the yes and, where you're building on ideas. And then depending on how you want to finish it up, the facilitator can gather the ideas to process them offline, or now all of a sudden you have, you know, 27 ideas instead of 2 that you can pick from and really get to the best solutions. That is part of the reason why we say businesses achieve better results when women are included. So when they're fully included and their voices are heard, we can do all that much better.
Thank you. I am told that we have 4 minutes left, so I will pose the last question to the panel, and I will ask Gabriela to start. In light of all that we have heard, you know, what is the most important thing that we could do to accelerate not only the integration of women into the workforce, which has been the subject of this discussion, but actually the empowerment of women overall?
So
1 minute each.
1 minute, okay, because I have more than one thing. But I, you know, just again, so much gathered over the last day and a half of conversation here. But I think one of the themes that I heard that is incredibly important is we just have to acknowledge the power and the opportunity that exists with women being 50% of the population, 50% of the economy, 50% of the business growth opportunity out there. I think if people can really embrace that in their heads to begin with, then the incentive and the desire to incorporate us further and really enable us and empower us further is should be self-evident almost. Some of the other themes that I heard that I really believe in as well is that it really has to start top down, especially I think when you talk about business corporations, which have been predominantly masculine over time, and in some arenas still persist as very masculine. I think really just starting at the leadership level, CEO on down, supporting, putting programs in place to make sure that women are being heard, identified, trained, empowered, enabled in the organization is incredibly important. More women in leadership positions. I went back to that, the rule of three. You sort of get that momentum when you have more than one. You can't just have the token woman, and frankly, 3 is even feeling token these days as well too. So getting to 50% or more is really where we should be. And then lastly, I think just filling the pipeline, and all of us who are in leadership positions really focusing on filling that pipeline through education, through training, and then I think most importantly through sponsorship and mentorship. We should see ourselves, all of us, as sponsors in our organizations, and we should be pulling up other women alongside us as well.
Maya?
I think as it relates specifically to STEM, I think we have a lot more power than we think. There is a massive talent shortfall globally, and as women in technology, we have the opportunity to select the companies that are doing the best work in this area, that are providing diversity across their workforce, and to select those as the places where we will take our jobs. And so as talent is short, we should really vote and like vote with our feet and walk and work for those companies that uphold the values that are important. And we can do that not only in the places that we choose to work for, but also in the products that we buy and the services that we use, and really use our own power to self-select those things, and then the business and economics gets behind it as well.
Right. Kelli?
So I would like to encourage everybody to think about the personal platform that you have. So you have the ability to influence in your personal sphere and in your professional life to change the culture. And what I encourage everybody to think about is, how do we change the culture from, here's how we teach women to be men. This is the behaviors you need to be successful. And move that culture to, let's embrace that women are different, feminine leadership is different, and it has its advantages. So instead of mentoring and coaching people or setting the expectations to our children and our families that women have to give up aspects of femininity in order to be successful leaders, that we embrace them for who they are, because they bring a lot to the table.
Let me thank the panel for their very interesting, insightful presentations. I'm sorry that Gabriela is not here. And let me leave you with one very profound and short thought. This was actually said in Paris in 1912, 107 years ago, by a gentleman by the name of Abdul Baha, who at that time was the head of the Baha'i community. And I think it captures in many ways, a lot of the insightful statements that have been made today. He said, as long as women are prevented from attaining their highest possibilities, so long will men be unable to achieve the greatness which might be theirs. Thank you.